So let's talk about the shapes here, because I don't think I've really given you a general sense of what we mean when we talk about using good shapes and good lines and so forth. So, the first thing is kind of what I mentioned already is and this may involve just slowing down a little bit when you go through this. But it's totally natural. I mean, my line work and my shapes were so sketchy and unrefined for so long, so it does take time to develop a sense of this. But when you're putting these things down, like let's take this line for example, instead of kind of going in and maybe sort of trying a few things out and then maybe erasing it a little bit and sort of seeing how that works, take a moment before you put that line down and think about how you really want it to go. Think about what the segments are going to look like and why you want them to be that way. And I know this is like a little too you might feel a little too in depth for this level of the phase, but this is just something I want you to be thinking about generally. So for this could be simplified as this, something like that. This line here maybe could be simplified as something like this. This is going to just be a general practice. This applies to your brush strokes as well, but sort of resisting the temptation to start making strokes as soon as you kind of open up the page and start trying out this different stuff. And it will depend upon your style a little bit too, but even if you are a little bit sketchy with it, I encourage you to really sort of take some time to think about when you're putting these lines down, think about just creating a little bit of boldness and simplicity with them. And once again, that's something that does come with time a little bit, but the more you practice it, the more you're going to get used to making lines in this way. And then another thing to consider here too is when you are creating your lines, and I'm bringing this up now, and we're going to keep touching upon this because this is something I have to remind myself about all the time. But this is sort of a general principle of shape distribution, of line distribution, of value distribution. It applies to a lot of things, and it kind of comes back to, we were talking about like the Fibonacci spiral earlier, and it's or like the golden ratio or whatever. And basically, and it's the same thing with the rule of thirds, right? It's the same reason why we place this character here generally instead of right in the middle. And once again, not to say that doesn't work, but these are choices you have to make deliberately. So the same thing goes with line width. So if we have a line, let's imagine a straight one for a minute here. We could bisect it evenly and have two, widths of equal length. And what we want to aim for generally, and what I'm telling you this because it's a good place to start. The more you learn this, the more, learn the rules so you can break them, right? So we learn this and we apply it, and then eventually we learn where maybe we don't want to do this. But this is a great place to start, and this is where I've started, and I still use this a lot in my work. So we want to think about this maybe in terms of like a 70 to 20 to 10 ratio. And this can apply to anything in terms of from value distribution, like I said, to shape distribution, to line width. Here we're going to talk about it in terms of line width. So this can apply to changes in the line direction. It can apply to where the line meets the canvas, right here. So like if we take the edge of your canvas down here, for example, we think about this as the overall length. Let's look at where these lines intersect the canvas here. What I'm seeing here is we have about equal length in these two segments. And we have a very small segment here, and then another maybe slightly less width on that last segment there. So what I would aim to do probably is, we could, for example, move this over here and have it intersect over here, and that way these two lengths on the left side are not the same length. And that's something that the eye just naturally appreciates. We love to see variety, and that's all. This is just a complex way of saying we want variety in everything we do. even if we're repeating elements in our scene, for example, if we have some mountains in the background, we don't want to be doing this. This just looks super unnatural to our eye. And it's obviously because this is something we would never see in nature. So if we were creating mountains, we would want to, and this is how it applies to shape, we would want to think about doing it in the same way, maybe having one really big one, maybe one sort of smaller one, and one medium. So you hear, I think you've been following Tyler Edlin as well. He says this all the time. A lot of people say this a lot, big, medium, small. In most things you do, you want to kind of, and that's another way of talking about the sort of 70-20-10 ratio, is you have your big, your medium, and your small. So let's talk about how this applies to line segments first, and then we'll talk about how it applies to shapes too. So let's take this line segment, for example, from here to here, and let's simplify it into its basic components. Right off the bat, we can see this is very complex. And also, we have repeated elements here. If we look at this segment and this segment here, see if I can isolate those in a different color, for example. So we have repetition. We also have primarily small and medium shapes here. And a lot of these are roughly the same length. So if we were to rephrase this and sort of find a way to say the same thing with less, maybe we could think about doing something like this. There's big shape, small shape, medium shape, maybe another big shape. And also these can be curves too. When you're creating lines, you can create straights or curves. I would often consider a curve to be sort of one segment, and I use that frequently. For example, if I'm creating a landscape, I might do a curve from the edge and then another, something like that, and I would consider that sort of 3 different line segments. But when there is a clear change in the line direction, that's what I would generally consider a segment to be. So we could do something like that. We could start with a medium, maybe a little small, bigger shape like this, something like this. And in all those situations, it's going to simplify this information and make it a lot easier to read for the eye. And it's also going to make it look more naturalistic for the eye. And now something I said before, or I hope I've said this already, is, we generally want to create more complexity and interest around our focal area and less complexity and interest around the edges of the canvas. So, which, we have here, we have sort of a complex thing going on with this character. And one thing I just want to point out really quickly is even within areas of complexity, we want to be following the same kind of principles. And I won't do the same thing with this character here because I think I've made that point already. But just think about this in terms of your general shapes and line widths, and also, look at the negative shapes as well and think about how those are playing out a little bit. But returning to the matter of sort of less complexity and interest towards the edges of the canvas, there are a lot of ways we can simplify what's going on out here to draw more attention in, because the eye is always going to be drawn towards complexity and contrast and saturation and so forth. And so if we have a lot of stuff going on here, or a lot of lines kind of converging in one area, or something like this, which is a tangent, which I'll get to in a second here as well, it's going to be very interesting, and it's going to pull direction away from where we want things to be. So we can simplify this shape with something like that. We could do the same thing over here. I think, and you know, a lot of these sort of shapes out here can be simplified a little bit. That's not to say that when you go into like the texturing or detail phase, you won't introduce maybe a little bit of variation here. But at this point in the process, we want to really simplify these shapes and make sure that overall with our composition, there's nothing too overly complex going on here. You know, there are some exceptions to this, which is something that really advanced artists do, which I'm kind of hesitant to introduce at this point. But if you do, for some reason, really want to have a lot of really complex stuff going on around the edges, say you have a whole bunch of different focal points and you really want to have a lot of detail throughout your painting, you can offset their sort of you can offset their eye-catching potential by lowering things like contrast and saturation and stuff like that, and you know, adjusting your values so that they're not quite as eye-catching. But for now, I would really just stick to simpler shapes, simpler lines towards the edge of the canvas, and more complex shapes and lines towards your focal area or focal areas. Let's talk about tangents real quick before we move on to that, because I really this is really important. And so I'm not sure if we've gone over this yet, but basically in brief, a tangent is a space or, you know, two lines or two objects that are almost touching but not quite touching. So that's something like that here. We have a similar thing kind of going on here. One thing I see with a lot of beginner artists, which I haven't seen too much in your pieces so far, but you can see it a little bit here and there, is there's this temptation to create objects in our scene to follow the edge of the canvas. So for example, if they were creating, you know, some rocks, they would want to have them kind of come around here almost like it was a frame for everything else. And this is immediately suspicious for the eye, because when we create a painting, we don't want to create a two-dimensional composition. We want to create a window through which our audience is viewing the scene. And when we are viewing the world, lines and objects will go directly off the edge of the canvas. In fact, the more dramatic our perspective is, the more directly these lines will move towards the edge of the canvas. So one thing we want to avoid, which I'm not, like I said, I'm not seeing too much here, but I'm just going to bring it up anyway because we're talking about tangents, is having, for example, shapes that are coming like this very close to the edge of the canvas and sort of trailing off and not quite directly intersecting it. Like these are great. These could even, you know, maybe be a little bit more angled, but you know, here we have clear intersection with the edge of the canvas. So we know that it's leaving our viewpoint, and it's not just, there's no question about whether, you know, whether it's overlapping something or not. And that's the issue with tangents, is it makes it unclear for us at a glance whether or not these shapes are overlapping or not. It is clear here, for example, that these shapes are overlapping, and that's making it easier to read for our audience. Here, not so much. So what we would want to do is, you know, just make sure that these objects are a little further away, or there are two solutions to a tangent. We can bring them further away, or we can have them clearly overlap in another way. And with that in mind, I think this shape is a little bit unnecessary, because it's basically just following the same path as this other shape, and then it's coming very close to it and forming a tangent with it. So we can go ahead and get rid of that entirely. Or if you really like the way this shape is, we can have it merge with this other one and have this all be one shape. Let's talk about flow now. Basically, we want to use our shapes to guide the eye towards areas of interest. And you can do that by creating pathways from our foreground to a distant object, or if the object of our focus is in the foreground, we can use distant objects to draw attention to our foreground object. But whatever it is, we want to draw focus from the edges of our canvas into our focal area. So what this means is often creating sometimes literal, sometimes more symbolic pathways from one area to another. So when we create our lines, we want to think about them as a pathway the eye can follow. So if the eye, we imagine it as our eye traveling around the canvas, and actually this is what the eye does when we're looking at a painting, is it's constantly moving. It's flipping back and forth between different areas that it finds interesting. And all this happens in a fraction of a second. And depending upon how you set up your composition, it will either keep the eye in the painting or it will lead the eye out of the painting. And this, like I said, this will happen in a second. But if you don't have strong flow and strong shapes in your composition to keep the eye there, a person will look at your painting and then they will keep moving. Their eye will keep moving onto something that's a little bit more interesting. So that's what we want to do when we're creating these paintings, is we really want to capture them and keep them there. And that's what's going to really make it interesting and pleasing for them. And that's what's going to make your designs look great. So, let's look at the flow for these shapes, for example. So if I simplify this, we've already talked about the edge complexity. So let's just imagine it's something like this. And then this one is something like this. And we have a line coming in from here over here. We have this coming down like this. So as it is, if I enter the canvas anywhere around the edge, how am I going to get from point A to point B? Let's look at the path that we have to travel in order for that to happen. So let's say I come in here and I see something interesting, and then, okay, so I'm following this, and okay, well, the easiest thing for me to do is to just keep going off the edge of the canvas. But let's, so here's one thing. Actually, let's make a new layer here. The easiest thing for me to do is to go off the edge of the canvas. So that's one issue. So let's say, we have to take a very sharp turn to get over here, which doesn't feel good for the eye. And then, okay, now we have something else that's kind of leading our eye up here. Okay, now we're off the canvas again. But say we don't, we just decide to keep going here. Now we have, okay, here's another thing. We can lead us off the edge of the canvas. And then, okay, say we continue on. Now we finally get to our destination here. This is kind of a fun thing, and actually something you can try with your compositions. It's like a little game if you want. But okay, let's try another thing. Say we start up here. Let's use a different color. The eye comes in from this edge, and it comes down here this way. Okay, so we have basically an equal chance of going left or right here. Because it's coming in at a direct angle, we have basically a 90-degree angle on both sides. We could either go left towards our focal point or right away from our focal point. So we basically have a 50-50 chance of getting where we want to be, or once again, going off the edge of the canvas. And, both of these scenarios would lead off the canvas in that case. So what I'm getting to here is one way we could fix that. Even one way we can just subtly increase the chance of our viewer ending up at the focal point is just by changing the angle of this slightly. So now it's slightly, if you think about a car moving along here, it's going to be slightly easier to turn, left and go towards that area than it is to turn right. Let's try another path. Say instead of leaving here, they come in at this place, so they're coming down this way, and once again we have kind of a 50-50 chance of going left or right. So we could go off the canvas again, or we could come back here. It would be a little bit easier for us to keep going here, but this is kind of interesting, so we're gonna go off the edge of the path again. So you can kind of see what I'm getting at here, and that is that we want to make it really easy for our viewer to get from one place to another on our canvas. So let's reimagine this for a second. So we'll put our focal point here of Our Lady with the staff, and then we have some kind of door around here. So let's think about how we can create this exact same scene, and use our shapes to support it a little better. So we had this rock in the foreground, right, along the left side. So we can change how we construct that rock. And the great thing about this too is it works with our perspective. Generally, the way perspective works is going to support flow in our painting. You know, we've talked about as objects recede into the distance, they will tend to go towards this vanishing point. And that works in our favor in this case because the shapes of our objects are going to already tend to move in this direction. So we can think about that when we're creating this rock here. We can make it a little bit three-dimensional, and maybe we have another one over here. And now these lines are sort of leading inward already. So that's a good thing. And also, you know, take a look at this, for example. Instead of the rock kind of pointing backward like this or kind of meeting it at a direct angle, it's sort of flowing inward, meaning that flow is going to move in this direction towards the point of the rock. So, and let's see, we have another rock on the other side. Okay, great. So maybe we can kind of do the same thing. And say, for example, we want to have it kind of, you know, looking like this. We want to, just for whatever purpose, we want the edge of our rock to look like this. That's fine. We can use the angles of the rock. Say there's like a slight deviation there. We can use the perspective and the angles of the rock to create lines of flow from the edge of the canvas inward. And now it's just up to us to make sure that the journey does not stop there. We want to make sure it continues on and doesn't just go off the edge of the canvas like that. So with that in mind, let's create another pathway, maybe something that forms like the edge of the cave that we're talking about. So I just want to create a nice line going from here to there, overlaps clearly, intersects clearly, and or maybe even, you know, have something else coming from here, just so it's maybe this is all one shape. We can also have objects on the ground, you know, just sort of lines of perspective that we can use. And these will just be cues for textures that we create later. But for now, we can represent them with lines. So now let's think about the edge of the cave here. Remember I was talking about that sort of straight up and down angle. And that's something we can do if this was more of an architectural thing. If I did that, for example, I probably wouldn't want to have them too far out like that. Or if I did, I might want to have something else that's helping to lead the eye in here, just so we can really make sure it's easy to get from the edges of those, of the cave or the doorway or whatever it is to the focal area. We can also put them closer so that it's clear they're kind of part of the focal area, and that way it's not so hard to get from there to here. But let's say we want to stick with our cave for a minute here. So let's kind of follow what we were talking about before, have a little bit of a curve coming in here, just so it's easier for the eye to get to the base of this focal area. We can do the same thing over here, maybe stagger them a little bit. And, you know, just to make it a little more naturalistic, maybe have some slight variations there. We don't have to worry about that too much at this point. And then over here, you know, it's kind of up to us, whatever we want to do. Another thing, we can create our sort of composition blockers. So, this will sort of depend upon how you use them. We can create something like this or like this that will sort of, if there is something leading in this direction, it will make sure that the eye is sort of led away from the corners, which are just because they're sharp, they're the most they're the easiest way for the eye to leave the canvas, which is why we generally want to avoid having a line lead directly into that corner. It's another type of tangent. We can use composition blockers to redirect focus away from that area and back to other elements in our painting, essentially recirculating attention, so that if the eye wanders over here, it hits this, okay, I got to go back over here, or okay, I got to go back over here, recycling back into the composition. We can, and remember this rock here, we talked about how it's sort of pointing outward like this. It's already pointing, which is giving the eye maybe an excuse to cross this gap, but we can make it even easier by maybe introducing some kind of lines like this. that form the edge of the cave, interior, something like that. That's going to make it easier to get from that point to the other. So let's compare these two for a minute. Now we can see that everything is sort of supporting this point of focus. Now, a question you might have at this point is, so we have the lines, we have the pathways to get towards the focal point, but what is stopping the eye from using the same path to leave the canvas? For example, if it starts here, let's use a different color. If it starts at our focal area, what's to stop it from following these same paths to leave the canvas and move on to a different painting? And that's where other elements such as the values you use and the saturation use and textures and complexity and so forth are going to matter here. Remember how I was saying this rock is super complicated, and that's going to be very attractive for the eye. If I have that super complex object here, it's going to be more likely that the eye is going to follow this path towards that area than it is to follow this path towards another less complex area. Likewise, if there is a higher level of contrast or saturation around here, the eye is more likely to follow this path towards that and off the edge of the canvas. So this first phase of the process, where we're just focusing on lines and shapes, we are creating essentially the pathways, the roads for the eye to follow. But it doesn't necessarily, we can manipulate complexity and so forth, so we can start that process of deciding what direction the eye is going to flow, but that's also going to be influenced by the later parts of the process, including what values we use and the levels of saturation and color we use later on.